So smooth. Hello and welcome to the Lunch and Learn. KPMG's our partner with High Growth Ventures to work on ESG impact and sustainability, but particularly focused on the climate tech startup landscape. My name is Charlotte, Director of Climate Tech Ecosystems here at Climate Salad. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we meet, the Gubbi Gubbi people. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to hand over to Kylie to do a much better introduction that won't happen twice.
Unlikely, Charlotte. I think you're nailing it. Look, so we're pretty excited. This is the first of these sessions that we're kicking off with Climate Salad. It's going to be monthly sessions that we're running throughout the year. They're really designed for the whole community to get access to the rich vein of subject matter expertise we've got across the KPMG firm in this sort of climate sustainability space. And we really want you guys to be able to get in and talk to these guys and ask them questions as you need. We've got people in the firm who are obviously having conversations with with government, with customers, with all sorts of people. So there's all sorts of ways that we know that we can support you, and we really want to be able to do that. So very much a chance for you guys to ask questions as you go. So jump in and do that whenever you need. And also feel free to sort of make suggestions to Charlotte at the end in terms of other topics you'd like to see. So really quick intro, if anyone that's not familiar with High Growth Ventures, we are a team within KPMG really focused on connecting founders and their teams to the services they need to grow sustainably, saving both time and money. So super focused on the startup space. We offer a whole range of specialised startup services for startups, really tailored to a bunch of different stages of growth. They include things like outsourced CFO, working with bookkeeping, tax structuring, but also across to R&D, government incentive support, ESOPs, all sorts of things. And it's really designed to be operated at a fraction of the usual cost, so that is accessible for startups. So for this first session, I think we kind of thought, there's so many topics that we could cover with this community because there's so many amazing things happening across the range of companies in Climate Salad. But we kind of thought we might as well just start off with that sort of whole ESG piece. There's so much noise everywhere. It's the talk of the town in the investor community, with corporates, with mid-markets, and everyone's sort of focused on their strategies. But we thought it'd be really interesting to explore what that means for you as a startup. And how you should be thinking about it, I guess, in terms of both engaging with your own customers, but also investors and customers, and just really what it should mean to you. So I guess to kick off with introductions, we've got two specialists today. Graham, who is meant to be joining us, I think is not on the call yet, but he's travelling. Oh, he's in. Oh, I can't see the screen. Sorry. Great. So Josh Keelan, first up, is a partner with KPMG. Josh is focused on ESG advisory to high growth ventures, family offices, and VCP funds on ESG and sustainability. Josh has also advised banks, large corporates, and state governments across the country on their ESG journeys. But importantly, he intimately understands the founder experience. He's been a co-founder himself, and he works extensively with the High Growth Ventures portfolio company. So welcome, Josh. And Graham Wood, glad you made it, Graham, is the founding sponsor for the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland, founding investor in Guardian Australia, and is behind the regeneration of the Triabuna woodchip mill into the events-focused Spring Bay Mill on Tasmania's east coast. He's a co-founder and chair of tech startup Mawson Ventures, co-founder and chair of Artology, and chair or board member on several tech startups and impact investments, and holds an honorary doctorate in economics from the University of Queensland. And he was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2012. So just a little bit impressive. Welcome, Graham. So to kick things off, I'm just going to jump in and ask you the first question, Josh. We actually interestingly ran a session here at KPMG last week, which was really focused on helping startups understand that ESG space and what it means for them. And Josh, I know that you mentioned one of the big challenges that was flagged amongst a lot of those attendees was really how should they be thinking about ESG and how should they be measuring impact? And I thought it could be good for you to kick off, I guess, right back at basics with a bit of a, what is ESG? How do you think about ESG? And how should founders of startups be thinking about it?
Thanks, Kylie. And this is one of those really fascinating questions we get from startups in this space, where they're coming to us saying, look, what on earth is ESG, right? And how does it relate to impact and sustainability? and all these other terms that we hear out there. And most importantly, where do we play? If we're a pre-seed, a seed, Series A, B, C, IPO, whatever, what matters? What should we do at what stage? And what are our stakeholders expecting us to do? And there's no simple answer to that. And what I want to unpack and explore with everyone today, and I'm glad to have Graham Wood here as well, is it really comes down to who are your stakeholders and what's actually important to them. Because when we think about investors and what a lot of our clients tell us, and I work with a lot of VCs and family offices as well, they all view this very, very differently. And so you have to think about who are your stakeholders, because if you're going to a family office or an impact investor, and Graham will talk about this in a lot more detail than me, a lot of the time they couldn't care less about ESG. What they care about is genuine impact. And they don't want a glossy report. They want to cut through the complexity and go, are you a good investment? Foremost. Secondly, do you create impact and does it align with their values and purpose? And a lot of the family offices I work with, they couldn't care if you've got an ESG framework or if it's the best of breed of anything. It is really, very, very different. But conversely, if you're going to some of the VC funds or a private equity fund and there's institutional money in that fund, often they will care about the corporatized ESG framework. And when I say corporate frameworks, effectively ESG is a corporate reporting framework. For good or for bad, is there as a way of measuring your performance as a company, in most cases, against the outcome of sustainability. Now, it's not perfect, and there are 400 or 500 plus different frameworks out there. So comparing apples and apples is really, really hard. And then you got to work out, okay, so if we're going to venture capital number one, and they subscribe to RIA, or the Responsible Investment Association of Australia, what does that mean? Do they have ESG screens in there? Do they have a scoring methodology? What do they expect on that continuum? Because most of them will have a stage appropriate journey. Some will go back to pre-seed and say we expect you to at least have some values in there. And what they expect in Series B will be quite different. But once again, that sits in a very big spectrum. So if you think about the capital market, we know that there was a RIA survey that is done every 30 June. And the last one said that about 43% of Australia's professionally managed capital sits within the realm of ESG somewhere. Now, it's basically saying that the other half doesn't at this stage. And also there's obviously capital that's not professionally managed as well, which I'll get Graham to talk about in a lot more detail than me. So it really comes down to thinking, well, what does that spectrum look like? Because on one side, you've got couldn't care less. On the far right-hand side, you've got philanthropy and impact investment. Now, those are two very different things, and I'll let Graham talk about that in a lot more detail later. But for your stakeholders, think about where they sit. Are they looking just to align or tick the box in a corporatized sort of framework? Or are they really chasing genuine impact underlying the business you've got? And that can be really complex. And so the first thing I'd say is work out who your stakeholders are. So your employees, your customers or target customers, and your investors and or target investors. Try and work out where they sit in this and where on those spectrums they might sit. And therefore, where do you need or want to play in that realm? That can be quite complex, and I hope we can unpack some of that for you as we go through this discussion.
Okay, great. And so Josh, what do you think the biggest challenges are for startups in this space?
Really knowing what and where to do. So once people do go through and work at, okay, so if I want to target this customer, whether it be Coles or Woolworths, and for good or for bad, they've got an ESG framework I've got to comply with, how do I go about tackling that? And then conversely, if I'm going after family offices or impact investors for funding, and they're on a completely different wavelength and terminology, how do I do what I do and frame up that conversation without creating a lot of complexity? You know, I'm a founder, I'm here to run a good business, I'm here to make money, create jobs, opportunity. And in this setting, as climate techs, you're here to actually create a positive impact as well. And you don't necessarily want to be distracted from all that for the sake of pushing out an ESG report on a bit of paper. Yeah. So you really need to think about where do we play, and often that's the hardest thing. And once you get to that thing, then the biggest question becomes, how do we actually measure this? What are we measuring and for whom? And how do we make sure it's not greenwashing?
Okay, and Graham, I'll just bring you in. So hard because I can't see Graham. But look, and Graham obviously sits in that space, which is sort of very much in the philanthropic space and the investment space. And so, Graham, I think it's really interesting to understand your thinking around, you know, how do you think about how you support companies and the types of companies you support? Like, what are the types of companies you invest in?
Thanks, Kylie, and thanks Climate Salad and KPMG for putting this very interesting topic on. Can people see me?
No.
Not quite.
I'm a tech genius, you know.
We all have our strengths.
I can't explain this. Anyway, I'm a very attractive looking chap. So where does ESG, let me go back to the sort of people I think we are speaking to right now. I assume they are founders, or they're one step removed from founders. Founders are typically pretty impatient people. They dislike bureaucracy. They dislike report writing and report reading. They just want to get on with the business. So I think there's a fundamental gap between a traditional or a normal founder and the whole topic of ESG. When we invest in startups or hire people, there's one thing that drives us, which is what is the degree of values alignment with that individual, with that group of people. And now that's alignment with our values, which we think are pretty okay, and support. I guess if you take that up the ladder, would support all sorts of wonderful ESG reporting standards. But finding that those people who really do understand the journey you're going on and want to be part of it, we find that the energy generated in a wholesome startup tends to attract people of the same energy and values. So I don't think I've answered your question, but
I guess part of it, Graham, is like, I think the interesting thing, because we had a chat yesterday, and I know that for you, ESG is not the thing that's the key. It is that, making sure that you are having impact, that, what is that impact that you're having?
Oh, absolutely.
I think what's interesting to understand is how like, if these guys, if it's a bunch of founders on a call saying we're interested to approach impact investors and be able to show them the impact we're having, I think what's interesting to understand is what are some of the ways to do that? What are some of the ways that you would say that they can get that across to you and actually show clearly the impact that they're having? How would you think about that?
Well, simply tell me your story. What are you doing? And you describe to me in your words what you believe the impact is. And if they start waffling, we'll soon tell them that that's not an impact, that that's, go back and try again. So until you get into those conversations, until you are actually close to changing something, impact is all about change. It's improving the environment for the better. It's improving the social cohesion for the better. And it's also about making a reasonable return for the money invested. So it's a gut reaction to somebody who comes up with an idea, and we get, I don't know, 2 or 3 a day of these things floating across our desk. And most of them you just yawn and move it on because there's nothing original about it. There's nothing unique. So another app for something that's been done over 1 million times, it's pretty hard to get excited about.
And it's interesting, someone who's just asked a question, last year 75% of private startup capital went to support mobility and energy related startups. How do we influence the rebalance to support underweight areas such as food and ag, built environment or industry? Do you have thoughts on that, Graham and Josh?
I might throw to Graham if that's okay. I know Graham invests specifically in regenerative agriculture and food as well. I think maybe if you can share, Graham, what you see in that sector and also some of the imbalance, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, the regen ag is a fabulous sector. There are some very good operators out there. There are a few shonky ones as well. It's kind of tied in with the carbon offsets thing, which has got a few hairs on it at the moment. But to make a real difference to the quality of the soil, to have more carbon buried in the soil, to grow crops without artificial fertilizer, and to retain more moisture in the soil, these are all wonderful things. To intersperse that with treed areas so that you're growing trees to keep the local koalas alive at the same time. Pardon me, I'm in an airport lounge, if you can hear that. So regen ag is a great field for us. There's another one I'm involved in that converts nutrients from aquaculture and sewage treatment plants into algae, which then becomes a biostimulant to help grow crops faster. So those sorts of investments have very clear outcomes. You can quantify the difference. And there are many more than that. So the question is, how do you rebalance? Well, it means dragging investment away from less impactful areas into these. And that's happening. Is it happening fast enough? If there's tax incentives, there are government regulations that could change. So there are many levers here to redirect investment. Governments have been trying to play that game for a long time. And maybe the crowd who are in Canberra right now might be a bit better at it than we've had for the last decade.
I reckon from our perspective as well, Graham, what we're seeing for the first time, specifically in the family office space, is a real shift. We heard from a few family offices that we worked with last year that for the first time, some of the impact foundations or their PAFs have up to 50% impact, I mean proper impact, hopefully in most cases, built into that fund. And they're still looking at achieving commercial returns. So we're not talking about donations and grants. That might be a separate philanthropic aspect to many family offices. But increasingly, there's a recognition that, hey, we can actually do this. We can really support private capital being deployed to create that impact. And increasingly, as that can be proven and we can debunk these myths that impact doesn't, create revenue and opportunities and wealth, we are seeing increased appetite with a lot of traditional family offices to start thinking about how they deploy their corpus. Now, at the moment, I can't think of very many of mine that have deployed any of their corpus into impact. If they have it, it's probably by accident. However, as that changes and as that understanding around what impact investment actually is and how that differs from philanthropy, I think that's a really exciting opportunity to mobilise the private capital aspects of the Australian capital market. As for institutional money and for VC money, that can be quite a challenge because there's a lot more bureaucracy and systems and processes in that versus aligning with values and purposes, as Graham said as well. So hopefully over time that will change. And I think that recognition and understanding is certainly coming through. And a lot of the officers we work with are saying, look, climate change, as bad as it is, represents a really good investment opportunity. So high growth ventures who can help be part of the solution, one, create a solution, and two, represent a really good investment opportunity because this is probably the best thing from an investment lens since the dot-com boom. And we're hearing that a fair bit, particularly in the last 6 months. So for climate techs out there, as long as you are creating that genuine impact and you can convey that, I think you are well placed. But the trick is you have to just literally have to create the impact to start with.
And it's interesting, Josh, because the other thing is, and we've talked about this in the past, is how you differentiate. Like how do you differentiate what you're doing that's different? To Graham's point earlier, there's he says a lot of things come across his desk, but there's probably no differentiation in why is that doing anything different to what I've seen? I guess, is that measurement piece part of the differentiation, or is that really just about getting your story straight and actually being able to understand what else is happening in the market? And Climate Salad's great because you can see like an enormous cohort of companies in one place. It's a really good way to kind of understand who else is doing what, which is great. And the community nature of Climate Salad, I think, is great for that. But what are your thoughts on how you differentiate or how you do that? And does the measurement piece play into that? I noticed with the poll, half of the companies out there are saying they've been asked about ESG strategy. That the companies out there that are responding to that poll are saying measurement is a key thing for them. So, is that part of that building the story?
Yeah, look, it is. It comes down to, in my view, ESG isn't something you do. If you're looking at ESG, and I'll get, there's a question in there about what ESG impact and sustainability actually means, and we'll come back to that. But it shouldn't be something you do. If it's said as a silo or a compliance activity, you're sort of missing the point of it. Really, it should be everything you do. It should be your business, your culture, the way you do things. And if you think about it in that sense, it makes more sense to go, well, it's just good business, right? Particularly in this climate tech audience. So in that sense, it really comes down to, well, how do we measure that and how do we convey the narrative? Because really what it is a narrative. And like all narratives, it comes down to who's the audience? And like I said before, the biggest challenge is that stakeholder process. So if you're going to rock up and pitch to Graham, don't go to him with the Global Reporting Initiative or the SDGs and go, look, we do this and we map into that. As you said, he probably doesn't care, and most of my clients won't care either. But if you're going to a VC that's backed by institutional money, then yes, you might need whatever framework they're using. And the problem is there are so many frameworks. You need to do the research to work out which one are they using, which bits are they using, to what depth are they doing it, and then think, well, how do we map into that? Because if you do want to have that conversation, if you go and talk to Graham, you have to create that narrative around values and purpose and genuine impact. But if you're going to go to the VC, really understand the framework, because those frameworks will create methodologies and have a way that you should represent what that looks like. And then you need the data and the processes to actually capture that data. Now, the other difference we see there is the depth and complexity that is required at a stage appropriate level. So a lot of the VCs I work with, if you're pre-seed or seed, they're not going to expect you to have this 100-page glossy report. A lot of them won't expect that ever, to be perfectly honest. But what they might expect you to do is think about how it aligns to your values and purpose as a business and as an organisation. They might have a few values-driven principles in the way they invest. So some will say, look, we only invest in this and we only invest in that. And that might be their guiding light. And so really they're after the narrative about how do you first fit and contribute to that guiding light? And that to them might be more important than how you fit with the 500 bits and pieces in the framework. But it comes back to that number one thing you have to do is work out, are they using a framework? Is it a corporate framework? Is it a values-driven framework, for want of a better word, like what Graham was just describing? Work out where they sit, because that will determine where you need to play if you choose to go down that road and partner up with them, so to speak. In terms of what's the difference, there was a really good question there about the difference between impact, ESG, sustainability. I tried to take this a step back. If we think about corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line reporting, these concepts have been around for a long time, right? And then they come and go as corporate fads come and go. True impact, as Graham has described it, hasn't. It's always been there. Graham's on the camera now. But the corporate frameworks do come and go, and obviously there's emerging regulation as well, which will shape what this looks like. In my simplistic view, I think of sustainability as the outcome we're looking to achieve. I look at it as ESG as a corporate reporting term that tries to measure your performance against that outcome as a company in most cases. And I think of impact as going beyond that into what is the actual impact you create. And there's three dimensions of impact in my view, and this won't be perfect, but level one is impact reduction. So you see this play out in terms of, okay, well, we're going to achieve a carbon net zero by whenever. You're basically saying we have a negative impact or footprint, and we want to slow that down or get it to a 0 point. The second dimension of impact says we want to create positive impact, and Graham mentioned regen farming. So this is about reversing that negative impact and actually creating a positive contribution to society. And that's really what we need to think about, particularly for a climate tech. Getting to net zero is no longer good enough, and a lot of companies and stakeholders are looking straight beyond that. So if you're just thinking about reducing your impact, that's a good start, but it is just the start. And then the third dimension of impact is collective impact. So once we get to positive impact, how do we get a like-minded bunch of people, organizations, or communities working together to create that positive impact and then driving that forward? So I hope that sort of answers that in a very vague context, but unfortunately there's no firm definition of it. It is a collection of ideas and thoughts.
And Graham, there's a question in here about B certification. Do you see that as valuable? Mute.
Right, can you hear me?
Yep. Gotcha.
Can I come to B Corp in a minute? Just back to the question about how do you move the goalposts here? How do you get more family offices in particular focusing on impact? There's an organisation called Groundswell who focus on old money that has now been, the kids are coming along and taking over. So the guy who made billions digging coal or whatever, the kids have come along, they are now running the business. Groundswell actually targets them, brings them all together, targets them is a crude word maybe, but that is actually changing the way these people decide to invest, because they see, basically, I've got dirty money on my hands. What can I do to clean up the act? And some of those really pick it up and run with it very hard. So that's number one. As a startup or a business looking for finance, and you go along to somebody who runs a fund, the first question I would always ask, what are the mandates for this fund? Tell me what you can and can't do. That's normally spelt out very strictly. So here's an opportunity to educate up, because presumably you'll be talking to various funds. If one fund is saying, well, you must tick these boxes, then you, as the potential investment, can say to them, well, look, mate, I haven't got time to do that sort of stuff. I'm going to this opportunity over here, who in the fullness of time we might get there, but people who try and enforce ESG down on an audience that's not ready for it can also be changed in their thinking by people walking away. So, sorry, I don't want your money. Now, B Corp, in a way, the whole B Corp thing, I wouldn't like to say is superseded, but they've done a brilliant job. We applied to become a B Corp at Spring Bay Mill, and we failed because they've got this incredibly complex tick box approach. We wasted man months, woman months, going through the nonsense. In the end, we just threw in the towel and said it's not worth it. So B Corp, if anyone from B Corp is listening, kind of needs to modernise their approach, I think, because it started out brilliantly and it's been going for a while now, but they seem to have become very structured and very inflexible, and that's their game. But are good companies doing everything that a B Corp does anyway, just because they've got the right mindset? Do they need? What's the value of a B Corp certification is the other question.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question here, Josh, around what should startups look to showcase with ESG reporting when we don't have the resources to do full-scope ESG reporting through rigorous frameworks. But it might be interesting for you, just given you've got a bit of that lens across the sort of family office and VC, like a range of those spaces. What are you, because I think we had another question we're going to look at, which is like the stage. At what stage should you be thinking about this, and what's appropriate at each stage? If you could just talk to that a little bit, would be helpful.
Yeah, can do. And I think if you're pitching solely to family office, I wouldn't go down the reporting route at all. It's only if you feel there's a need or a value proposition. So for me, if you think about doing this, let's assume for now that you're already creating that implicit hopefully positive impact anyway, right? Just by the way of being who you are and what you're doing. Put that aside. In terms of how you create that narrative of the reporting, as Graham said, if you're going for a family office, think about what their values and purpose is and align that to your narrative and make sure they're apples and apples. But if you're going for a more, someone else with a corporatized version of it, then you really need to think about, well, how do we create that reporting? Most VCs that I work with and what we see out there with our clients as well, the high growth venture landscape, don't require full-blown reporting. The requirements are changing, sure, but often it's most important to demonstrate you're on a journey. It's got to be stage appropriate, it's got to be realistic, and it's got to be genuine. So what people, even the VCs with these ESG mandates, want to hear is, what are you doing intrinsically? What is your business idea and what is the impact you're creating? We don't really care if it doesn't perfectly align, even if we do have a corporate framework just yet. We'll worry about that later. If you're going to do an IPO or whatever, obviously it needs to align. But for now, no one is really expecting you to be perfect. And certainly no one expects you to have a really robust, big glossy report. Maybe there's a few that do. However, they want that commitment and they want to see a genuine commitment and then a shift to action. So if you're in the space where you're saying, look, we have some negative impacts and we have some commitments and these are the strategies, whatever you do, don't leave those as hollow commitments. If you make a commitment, have a strategy, have a landing strategy, make sure it's genuine and stay well away from that greenwashing landscape. And that comes back to that comment Gray made. It comes back to what is that underlying impact you create? And one of the things we do is actually create a roadmap of where are you now? Where do you want or need to be and by when? And how are you going to get there over a period of time? Now, like I said, very rarely is that expected to be tomorrow or next year. You're a founder, focus on being a founder and doing that well and growing this business. And if that creates impact and collective impact intrinsically, growing that is the best thing you can do. And then let's think about how you create that narrative off the back of it.
And there's a question here that really talks specifically to this sort of the measurement piece. It's probably a good one. I'm not sure who's best placed for it. Is there any specific framework for ESG strategy that well integrates into the strategy and culture of an EV charging e-mobility startup? Should I link the value and impact to, for example, something like planting trees for a specific number of kilowatts charged as a positive impact and reduction of carbon footprint as the reduction of negative impact?
Look, this is a really fascinating question. I think it's one we could delve into a lot, and I don't want to sort of derail the conversation. But certainly, typically, entities in that space might look at a funding or a strategy that targets those with a decarb perspective and go, well, that's what we do. How do we have that conversation? But I might throw that one to Graham because he obviously plays and invests in that space to get his thoughts on that.
Just need you to unmute, Graham.
Can I answer another question that you haven't asked me first?
Yeah.
One of the real impact potentials is, sure, we can sink carbon, we can do all that obvious measurable stuff. One that's of increasing interest to me is in actually changing behaviour of consumers. Say, if everyone stopped drinking Coca-Cola in the world tomorrow, Coca-Cola would go broke. So there's immense power in consumer activism that no one's, I mean, that example is probably a bit on the wild side, but simply, let's say, stop, rather than be told, don't drink drinks full of sugar or eat crap food full of salt. If people decided themselves to do that, then we all become healthier, blah, blah, blah. It's the same thing with the consume and throw away society that we have, that no amount of change, if we're looking to actually change the rate of environmental destruction by overuse of resources, one way to do that is to stop consuming. So you can't go from 100 to 0, but any campaign that starts to actually change consumer behaviour can have a big impact. There's not much out there that's doing that at the moment. So it's buying an EV instead of an ICE vehicle. That's great. But if more and more people could be convinced to drive their ICE vehicle off a cliff, no, don't do that. Just, I don't know what you do with them. Send it back to the manufacturer. I think I've made my point. I hope that the potential to change consumer behaviour is not being exploited. Sorry, it's being exploited for evil by all those cunning marketers out there. It's not being exploited for good by people who want to make a positive impact.
That raises a really interesting thought as well, Graham, just to butt in. We often think about, in the corporate landscape, managing your own ESG performance and then divesting of assets that don't meet that metric. And that's the same as VC funds, right? Now, the opposite of that is invest and influence and create that positive impact. Now, this creates a bit of a theoretical debate. But in theory, if I want to clean up my personal ESG impact, I go and sell my car, for example, and go, great, my carbon footprint's now less, I bought an EV, but then old mate down the road has bought it. So I've shuffled the problem down the road. The same goes with investments. If I sell my tobacco company, which I don't own, by the way, someone, hopefully, or hopefully not, is going to buy that. Now, ideally, if you can constrict their capital enough, no one buys it. Happy days from the ESG perspective. But do you have any views on that? Because that's a question that often comes up around divest or invest. I'd be keen to pull that apart. I think it links into another question around the S and ESG in the chat as well.
Yeah, my second-hand ICE vehicle becomes a bargain for the guy down the road who, yes, it's a problem. I don't know what the answer is. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's no perfect answer.
Yeah, and I guess this is this points this whole challenge. Like everyone's kind of saying, how do I position myself? How do I show my story? And it's very complex, like working out which investor do I have to show one story to versus another story. How telling that story is complex. So do you want to talk to that, the S and ESG, Josh? Like so this is from Charlotte, but thinking about Tesla, great impact, but operationally doesn't seem to meet the ethical and social threshold perceptions with a founder like Musk. So what's your thoughts on the sort of the S piece?
I've got a few thoughts on it. It's not a perfect answer, unfortunately. But S is often the poor cousin in ESG. So obviously there's a climate emergency. So E is prominent right now. Those who've heard me talk before have probably heard me talk about getting the concurrent balance right between people, planet, and prosperity. Because I don't think you can have any of those happening as a silo. If you have just E and not S and G or prosperity, for example, you have a charity in the E space. But if you're just in prosperity and don't care about the rest, you've got a corporate failure with the capitalism driving it. So it is really important to think about all those pillars concurrently and getting that sustainability mix right. Now, that is being, I guess, pronounced by the emergency we're faced with in terms of climate change. So that is bringing one to the forefront. If you want to, have an Earth to live on in a certain number of years' time, obviously you need to get that right, otherwise there'll be no S. So it's not an easy one to get right. People often struggle with it. And what we find with high growth ventures in particular, they are often really interested in the S when they think about their people and the communities they operate in. And often they're quite flexible. They rely on younger and diverse workforces where doing the right thing is really important. And they use it as a strategic tool to attract those people who share and align with their values and their purpose. So, hey, we are trying to change the world for the better. Come and work for us. We're doing the right thing. We are leading this conversation. So that can be a really powerful tool internally. We certainly see that playing out a fair bit, but certainly in the broader context and that example with Elon Musk, it is a real challenge in terms of that particular example. Which one do you value more in terms of, okay, we are helping the world decarbonize on one front, but potentially there's some S problems hidden in there as well. Which one's more important? You get a positive and negative. I'm not going to try and answer that. It's there can be trade-offs, and it comes down to what's important and to who. And ultimately, as Graham said, if we can inform consumers and let them make the choice, that is extremely powerful, and that can guide some of these conversations as well.
And it's interesting because, like, you know, I think generationally, if you see sort of generations coming through, the S is so important to them, you know, like it matters, you know, like with Musk's behavior, you know, there's a younger generation coming through who are saying, you know, this is not okay. Like, you know, so it's kind of fascinating to me that is playing out. And it's interesting to your point, Graham, about sort of the ESG itself doesn't matter. But, you know, what's behind that is the idea of saying, can I sort of take a lens to something and understand how am I trying to do all the right things to create impact across these different pillars? That becomes interesting, you know, so it becomes an interesting way of just sort of having a lens yourself on your business to say, what am I missing? Because, you know, to your point, Josh, if you're really focused on the E, you know, have you lost sight of some of the other sort of elements because you're so focused on one thing? So it's kind of like, to me, it's a bit of an interesting lens from that point of view of just trying to keep a balanced view where people are well-intentioned. So certainly not to be able to just sort of create a pretty document that says, look at me doing great things. It's actually about helping you get that lens to work out what are you doing right and where are the areas you need to develop. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, look, there's more questions coming through about metrics, which is really, like, it's interesting because it's the thing we see that those metrics, like that measure, is obviously what people are being asked for, you know, in market. They're being asked to show how you are different, show what you can do compared to someone else. So there's one here from Genevieve, you know, what metrics would a pre-seed seed investor use to think about assessing competing startups in the same vertical? For example, for agricultural solutions, forecasting potential impact between regenerative tech versus alternative proteins versus SaaS agri-tech. So I guess I wonder, is some of that about, is that a question about sort of stage as well? Like at an early stage, it's more of the story that you're telling or the picture you're painting about what you're doing matters more than a metric? Or do you need the metrics very early on, or a view on metrics very early on?
It really comes back to who's the audience in terms of what metrics are important to them, if any, right? So some audiences couldn't care less, and it's about narrative and values and purpose. Some will say, no, here's our framework, you will measure these things. And so the starting point I would always suggest is work at who your audience is, like who are those stakeholders and what's actually important to them, good, bad, and indifferent. And those stakeholders might have multiple perspectives on this. But as you go through that process, it'll help you determine, do we have to report to whom, under which framework, multiple frameworks, which components of those frameworks, and then within that, how best do we do that, given our stage appropriate, if we are, you know, earlier on that journey. So I can't give you a really clear, definitive answer on that, but if you go through that sort of process, that's how you would get to determining that answer for yourself as a startup effectively.
Yeah. And just one quick one, because I mean, Charlie was just saying, like, let's just sort of let the questions keep coming. But there's one more question for me, Josh, just around, because you're working with the sort of mid-market sort of enterprise clients as well. So with a customer, that end customer lens on, I guess, is there any advice you've got or any thoughts for these guys in terms of how they should be thinking about those end customers and what's the role of sort of ESG, or, you know, how should they be thinking about that, given a lot of those mid-market enterprise customers are now very focused on their own ESG strategies? Like, how do you match those two together?
This is a really fascinating one, actually. So if you think about it, if I'm standing in Dan Murphy's and I'm here to pick a bottle of wine, unless I know that company, I'm not about to pull out my phone and go through the ESG report and go, okay, this company versus that one, and try and work out what the hell's going on and what the true impact and sustainability is. So as a consumer, it's really hard to make those informed decisions, particularly when you're confronted with those glossy frameworks. We do know from research that consumers do want to make those informed decisions, and they would pay more and buy from those who can do it genuinely. Cutting through the complexity, particularly younger generations, right? But cutting through that complexity is the trick. Because even me, I'm not, as much as I work in this space, I'm not about to go and read someone's 100-page ESG report before I buy a bottle of wine, but I will connect to and be part of businesses that I work with and that I know that are genuinely doing it. And some of those ones in the wine sector, for example, might not even be producing ESG reports, but I know they're doing the right thing. Okay, so that's the retail perspective of getting, you know, actually connecting through to those end consumers. But on the wholesale side of it, can be really quite different. So if you're looking at supplying to a listed company who does have a really robust ESG framework, whether you like or not, you might have to plug into that. So I've got a family office who has had to plug into a corporate framework they otherwise couldn't really care about because they do want to keep supplying to that supplier. Likewise, we're getting a lot of mid-market companies coming to us and say, look, we're going for tenders, whether they're government tenders or larger corporate tenders, and we're being asked about our ESG policy and framework and what our report looks like. One, what is this? And two, how do we do that? So even though we're not being captured by regulation or voluntary standards just yet, if your end customer is, and they want to look downstream in their supply chain, you can be caught in that. And that can be quite frustrating, particularly if you're a high growth venture, because primarily you want to grow, you don't want to add complexity and compliance and those sort of things onto that conversation. So that is creating some real pain points. But we've had a few really good examples about if you do want to actually go out there and do this really genuinely and cut through and access those customers who do care, you really need to think about how you cut through complexity and compliance and really connect. And so you got that continual engagement, and that goes back to the start about understanding who your stakeholders are. And if that's customers, how do you get in front of them? How do you get your message in front of them? How do you make it believable? Because they're all being bombarded with sustainability. Now you can turn on the TV and say that this thing's carbon neutral and that's this, and everything looks green and sustainable. And if you're like me, you sort of question some of that sometimes. So how do you build confidence and trust? That can be really tricky. But if you get that, then you're going to start getting through to that value proposition.
Okay, that's another really good question here from Top Property. So in the climate tech space, there are fossil fuel companies, for example, that are starting to invest in this space. On one hand, there's money in this space to help grow a genuine clean tech business, but on the other hand, you're getting into bed with the enemy. So how do these conundrums play into the ESG space? What does it mean for you if you've taken that money?
This is a bit of a curly one.
Yeah,
I'm going to attempt to throw it to Graham.
Because anyone that's been a founder knows that you need access to capital. Like what if that's the capital you're being offered?
I've got clients who have flat out refused capital from an area they don't believe that the values align. They go, nope, not interested. Some will go, you know what? I'm going to get in bed with the devil, take that capital. I'm going to go there and change the world with it. And it really depends on where that founder sits in that debate. So I won't try and answer it, and I'm interested if you get any thoughts on it as well, Graham. But we do see both sides of that playing out.
Do you have thoughts on that one, Graham? Yeah. Oh, you're back on mute. It's just gone back on mute. That's it.
How's it? We have a pretty black and white attitude to dealing with the devil, because why deal with the devil if there's someone even, less devilish that you can deal with? But at Springvale Mill, we run corporate conferences and events, and most of those people are self-selecting. But part of what we do there is try and expose people, not try. People are exposed to the natural world. And that's a real shock for a lot of them. It's not a mid-city hotel. They actually walk around and there are seagulls in the air, and it's quiet. And, all those lovely things. There are birds and wombats and whatever. If they're there for 2 or 3 days, it does have a profound effect on them. Now, from that point of view, I'm one of the great enemies of the forestry industry in Tasmania. But if we often have politicians and people, ex-forestry people, who come to the mill for a variety of reasons, and I quite welcome that, because they can see I'm not the devil, or at least not obviously, and we can start to change the thinking of people like that simply by being exposed to the other way of looking at the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like Charlotte, your point that, so Mike Cannon-Brookes is a majority shareholder of AGL, and I think we would all say that's a good thing because he's going to drive change, so it's like he's obviously in a position of power compared to what most startup founders would be, but it's an interesting conundrum, really interesting one.
Can I just add one other thing? The getting back to that customer, the customer is, if you really understand your customer and really do a good job for them, they will sell your business for you. The word of mouth transmission of this is a good thing to buy is the most effective you can ever have. So that is investing in influence in a way, just by doing such a fabulous job for the consumer that they're forced to tell their mates that that bottle of wine is the only one worth buying because I've been to the vineyard and I can tell you it's legitimate and it tastes good. So really understanding your customer is so, so important, and particularly understanding what young people are thinking. So spend time with teenagers and listen to them and understand what's driving them, because they're the new market. And there's a big tendency in business just to listen to the traditional, observe the customer at Coles or whatever. But we work with creative development of young people through a variety of ways. And I'm just amazed every time I sit down and listen to them. I'm just so motivated and energized by them. It's wonderful.
It's very useful having teen to young adult children at this point in time. Because you find many different sort of, places that things are being discussed that you would never find. And it's really interesting to hear their view on things. It's fascinating. Yeah. Cool. So I think we're sort of coming to an end. Any other questions? I think I might have missed a couple along the way. Is there anything else anyone wanted to pop in there? Type away if there is.
Or feel free to come off mute as well.
Yeah.
I guess I would like to ask, where do we start? I mean, is that the first thing, to understand where your stakeholders are or who they are? Because I guess impact measurement is such a hard one. Olivia, if you can come off mute, we're doing the industry report, and one of the questions we ask is that impact measurement, like what are you measuring and how can we, because we would love to have a nice shiny figure of the collective impact of the climate tech companies in Australia, but it's not a shiny one figure. It's when you've got lots of different companies occupying different spaces, it's hard. So what is that first step that you would recommend for startups to take?
So from my perspective, think about who you are intrinsically and what you were here to create. So I like to think about it as a bit of a journey. So as a founder, generally I would say, why did you start a business? They'll be like, they'll tell you for hours, hopefully, about what they're doing, why they're doing it, their passion for it, how they're going to do it. So you think about that from a founder journey. Okay, we're here to make money, create wealth for ourselves, but also hopefully we're here to create impact. So if you know what the endpoint looks like and when you would like to get there, bring it back to, well, how do we know how do we start the starting point? And then we always work back with the ending goal. So know what the outcome is, know who the stakeholders are, know what your journey looks like, and that will help provide some guidance around what you do first and how you go on that journey. But I do tend to suggest originally at inception, work out who your stakeholders are and what's important to them, and continuously do that, because it does change. As Graham said, most of the family offices I work with, it's the next generation coming through that are having these conversations. The ones above often probably don't want to talk to me, but the next generation does. And that can be a really powerful thing as we look to change that private capital being deployed. So don't treat it as a static exercise. You really have to think about who those stakeholders are and how they change through time. And as Graham said, the teenagers of today, in 5 or 10 years' time, are going to be your buyers and getting to positions of influence and power in the coming decades ahead. So really understanding that and how that plays out. So that stakeholder mapping piece is really critical. And then thinking about, where do we play? Where's the value proposition to us? How does it align to our strategy and who we are? And start there.
And then the other thing that's probably worth mentioning, Josh, is that, we do have this ESG diagnostic tool, which is free. And so it's really, and it's basically gives you a bit of it gives you that lens on across those sort of pillars. Where am I operating now? And again, it's really designed for startups to kind of give you a sense of your positioning, and then basically you jump on a call with Josh or one of the guys in his team to actually talk through that and get some thinking about what are some of the things I could do. So that could, we've offered that out to the Climate Salad community as well. And again, it's free. It's a simple way to sort of at least get that lens as a starting point, knowing that, when you're really early stage, you're not meant to have a really sort of rich ESG, shiny strategy document, but at least you've got the lens, at least you've got the sort of the picture across a number of those pillars and some thinking around it. So we'll share that afterwards as well, because that might be valuable for a bunch of you.
Yeah, and we also do that with family offices as well. So we understand where they sit, or the ones that talk to us about this, where they sit. So it can be really fascinating to line up what the officers are thinking in this space and what the high growth ventures are thinking on the same topic.
Right. So anything else? Any other questions? Okay.
I was just going to ask that those that said yes, they have been asked about impact and ESG. What have you been asked about, and what are the answers you're providing at the moment? If anyone's brave enough to come off mute, I can see you, Chris.
You want me to chime in? I'll chime in. Just from our point of view. So we're obviously about trying to get homeowners into the hands of local installers for solar at this stage, and we'll be fanning out into more categories. And I find it very hard to measure or to put some meaningful statistics around our ESG impact, because we don't necessarily get visualization into what happens to that customer once that business has kind of picked them up and done the quote and all the rest of it as well. So the only way I can logically think to do it is take an aggregate of numbers and then make an assumption as to what percentage we think turn into jobs, what the average job size is, what that equals in megawatts, and then carbon sequestration, all the rest of it. So it's the best we can do with what we've got. And that's why I struggle to answer the question sometimes, because it's based on an assumption, and we put some numbers around what that would look like under a 1% conversion or 10% conversion or whatever it is. So from my end, it's difficult to put anything rigorous around it, because we don't get visualization in after that handover point.
Okay. Okie doke. So we're out of time, Charlotte?
Yes, we are at time, but thank you. I know there's some comments now. Thank you. And Gabrielle was after the ESG diagnostic tool, which we will share out. I've shared it, but I will keep on sharing because it's great to do. But can we pick your brain, Josh, or how do we go? Where do we go from here? Because I know that there's a lot of incubation of energy and action that's taking place, and everyone wants to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can tell, I love a chat and I love this space. So if anyone does want to reach out, get me on LinkedIn, obviously reach out an email as well, Charlotte. So happy to have a chat anytime, no cost. Yeah, happy to keep the discussion going.
And you're in Tassie, is that right?
I am. So I'm down in here, Tassie. Occasionally they let me out to the main island, but no, it's a great place to live. And I think what we're seeing in Tassie is a state that's really leveraging those natural capitals, and the work that Graham's doing at the Spring Bay Mill is an example as well, going, this is who we are, and doing it well. And it's not perfect, but it's on a journey.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Graham, and thank you, Josh. Really appreciate your time. For everyone on the call, we've got another session coming up next month on the circular economy. So we will be sharing that a bit earlier this time. We've all been a bit of a mad dash on this one, but we'll be doing these monthly. So again, if you've got suggestions or you've got requests for certain areas that you'd like us to sort of get some subject matter experts in on, we can do that. And just come along with questions. Really we want it to be about you being able to ask your questions and get you access to the right people, and people that are probably seeing a lot of things that are happening in different parts of the market as well. But thank you all. Thanks, Charlotte, for setting this up. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you, Graham. I know that you're in transit, so it's been always tricky trying to do things on the fly, but really appreciate you jumping on and joining us. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.